Welcome to Commsverse. This session is called Keys to Microsoft Teams Governance Success, and today will be presented to you by Tom Arbuthnot.
Thanks, Dave. Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Commsverse. We've already got a pretty good turnout for the first session, or my first session, so thanks for that. Hope you got to catch the keynote as well and see some of the cool stuff that's going on for the next few days. So this session is all about governance, not traditionally the sexiest of topics, but really, really important for your Microsoft Teams success, and it can really impact you if it's not done right as well. So we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about governance, security and compliance, why you should care, who should care, what your goals should be. We're going to talk about managing the team. So the language is fun here, but the teams part of Teams, you can think about that in the governance terms as kind of a data container, and how do we manage the life cycle of that team or group or container, who can create them, naming conventions, classifications, policies, that kind of thing. Also, I like to think about it as managing the team and then managing what's in the team. So you've got the ability to add apps, you've got the ability to add guests. Those are very hot topics in governance. And finally, a few thoughts on reporting. During the session, we've got live Q&A, so you can ask Q&A through the meeting, and Dave, who's my presenter, will be throwing out some questions as we go. And also after the session, we've got a breakout Teams meeting where we can catch up and have a chat as well. Before we get started, a big thank you to everybody who sponsors, massive turnout of sponsors. These events can't happen without the sponsors, and the sponsors come to support, but also for engagement. So be sure to take some time, ideally jump on the VR. There's also a Microsoft Teams team for the whole conference, and each sponsor has a channel as well. So if you could do nothing else than check in with sponsors you do know, say hello, maybe check out someone you don't know, ask some questions. That really helps support these events. So thank you again to all the sponsors. And when you're shopping for solutions around Microsoft Teams, these are the companies that are supporting the community. So keep that in mind. So why listen to me? It's a fairly valid question. I am in this space for quite a long time, 10 years plus now probably. I started off in the Cisco UC world. I jumped over to Microsoft UC, OCS, Link, Skype for Business, the usual track. What's interesting is I'm now talking about governance. I couldn't have imagined 5 years ago in the midst of Skype server, probably 2015, that I was, doing big global deployments on that I'd be worried about labels and retention and guest access and all that good stuff. But this is the way the world has turned now. We are using Teams, which is both collaboration and unified communications. And it's really important to embrace that reality, that a big part of Teams is collaboration, and a big part of collaborations is documents and data and access, and you need to have your governance set to make the most of that. Also speaking, blog, podcast, all that good stuff. If you want to find me, you can find me, and I get a great level of engagement from the community. So thank you to everybody who reads the blog or follows on social or engages on the podcast or anything else. Really appreciated. So first off, you hear governance, security and compliance kind of used almost interchangeably, and this is a bit of a challenge. There are no really good universally agreed definitions on these, and the lines blur. So expect these topics to overlap, and that's okay. If you try and box your governance questions and thoughts, your security and your compliance, you're going to struggle. They are going to overlap. Governance expands kind of to cover many areas. So there's Microsoft Teams governance, which is what we're talking about today, but then there's business governance and there's IT process governance. So governance is a general term. We're zeroing in on Microsoft Teams and how we handle that from a governance perspective. And you have governance for something. You can't just say, I have governance. It's governance for X. So in this case, the Microsoft Teams. Compliance is a bit different. So compliance, you can't just turn on compliance. You can't enable compliance. And Microsoft talk about compliance features, but you can't really say you're compliant unless you say what you're compliant against. And compliant could be against your own internal standards. It could be against a regulation, legislative rules, a specification. So common ones are GDPR. So that's been really a hot topic since that came in a couple of years ago, and making sure you're GDPR compliant. Sarbanes-Oxley is a big one. HIPAA is a big one. There's probably compliance requirements for your specific vertical or your specific organization. So when you talk about compliance, the question is, what are you trying to be compliant with? And if you can't answer that, you can't really talk too much about compliance. But to be compliant, you're probably going to have a combination of security and governance processes and procedures to meet the compliance requirement. So that sometimes helps think about it. So in our context for today, governance is really about managing the data containers, the data structures. So managing mainly the teams element of teams. There is some governance consideration about things like online meetings, who can get to them, who can record them, that kind of thing. But we're going to focus really on the teams element of teams. Security is about protecting the data, protecting access, ensuring the wrong people can't actively get to the data. And compliance is about meeting those specific requirements for your organization. So this is the other thing to consider with governance is Microsoft Teams governance. It's not really a thing. Like it's Office 365, Microsoft 365 governance, security and compliance. So Teams is often called a window to Office 365 or the front door to Office 365. It uses Office 365 groups. It leverages SharePoint. It leverages OneDrive in certain aspects for private chat. You have lots of third-party apps involved. So when we're talking about Microsoft Teams governance like we are today, we're going to be leaning on and leveraging Office 365 or Microsoft 365 features. And Microsoft 365, Office 365, Microsoft are increasingly using those terms interchangeably. So I'm not going to get obsessed about whether this week marketing is saying it's an Office 365 or a Microsoft 365 feature, but you will be using the wider Microsoft 365 stack for some of these features. So just leveling out on security, compliance and governance before we deep dive on governance. When we're talking about security features, we're talking more about authentication, access, multi-factor authentication, encryption. So Teams is obviously encrypted in transit and encrypted in rest, at rest, sorry. We're talking about things like advanced threat protection, safe links, conditional access. Those are security features. They might contribute to how you deal with governance, but they would be more security end type things. If we then think about compliance features, and as I said, you can't turn on compliance, but these are features that are targeted at helping you meet compliance requirements. So you have things like information barriers, and that is an ability to segregate groups within your organization or within your tenant and block them from communicating with each other. So sell side can't talk to buy side in a financial house, for example, or consultants on a certain project can't talk to consultants on another certain project. We're dealing with two vendors where these teams need to be completely isolated and unable to talk to each other. That is a really common requirement in financials, and that is a native ability in Microsoft Teams. You've got communications compliance, which is more about internal searching for words or phrases like secret project words, that kind of thing, making sure that that data is in the right place. You've got DLP, data leakage prevention. So whereas communications compliance is internal, DLP is about stopping data getting out, leakage, obviously. So for guests that are in Teams, it watches for certain things, and for external access or federation, it can watch for phrases in chat, that kind of thing. You've obviously got discovery and search, a whole big topic in its own right, legal hold, audit, reporting, and recently, as of about a month ago, we've got the session recording API, which allows compliance recording of audio, video, meetings, peer-to-peer, PSTN calls, all that kind of stuff. So if you're in a more compliant industry, those will all be on your list as things you probably need to think about or enable to meet the compliance requirement. And when we zero in on governance, we're thinking about the team creation process, naming policy, expiration policy, apps, permissions and policies, guest access. So we're going to zero in on the teams bit of teams and how we make that work for our organization in a way that maps to the compliance requirements, the business requirements, the usability requirements. Again, feel free to throw questions into the chat as we go. We'll keep an eye on that. So why does it even matter? Again, I come here with a unified communications traditional hat on. I had to spend a bit of time kind of changing the way I thought about the world and realizing this is pretty important. Well, you often hear these concerns in Microsoft Teams workshops or customers. Absolutely the number one, usually from IT, is team sprawl. Oh my gosh, we're going to have like a trillion teams and data's going to be everywhere and it's going to be a nightmare. This is IT coming from a place of command and control and process, and we want to have a very careful top-down hierarchy of where everything goes and put everything in a neat box. There's naturally a concern about letting the users run free and create their own teams. They're not going to use them properly, they're going to abandon them, they're going to create loads, that conversation. Obviously there's data in teams, so there are files, there is considerations around retention, there's considerations around deletion. If there's no owner of those files, how does IT know that they're being managed appropriately? So if owners leave teams, if owners abandon teams, who deals with that data? And obviously IT are naturally worried about that. Like all these teams get created, they're no longer the flavor of the week. Now IT have got a bunch of files that they're not sure whether to keep or delete or remove or archive or retain. That is a concern. The other huge one is guest access. So people get very worried about external guests getting access to information they shouldn't. A valid concern. Again, you look at modern laws around and requirements of compliance requirements around data access. Having people outside your org access data they shouldn't can be a real problem. So there's nervousness about, well, what can guests get access to and how are they controlled, how are they reported on? So you're not going to have a Teams project be a success unless you help with some of these questions. And who in the organization should care about governance or does care about governance? Well, legal should care because they want to meet all the requirements of the law, to meet their requirements and meet any compliance requirements. Security team will usually care, particularly around public and private access, external access. Obviously, IT should care because lifecycle management, data, user experience, that kind of thing. And the business and the users. And everyone cares slightly differently about governance. So the users are probably more concerned about usability, speed, finding their data. They're not worried about the wider loads of teams everybody in IT has to deal with. They just want to get their job done, and that is their job. So that's completely fair. So when you're having this conversation, you're probably looking for stakeholders in these areas. And hopefully I've hammered this home, but why does it matter? Well, you're going to be at financial, legal, and reputational risk if you're not compliant with standards. So if you're in a certain industry, you're in a certain vertical, you don't meet the compliance requirements, you can actually be taken out of that industry, potentially at the worst case. But you even can have issues around reputation, compliance, losing business. So there are real consequences to not having governance right. Beyond just the threat of the business problems, there's adoption. You have so much potential in Microsoft Teams, but if you do let it sprawl out of control, if you do have thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of teams and there's no management process, users will not understand where to go for what, and they will fall back to email, to chat. They won't use the Teams elements of Teams. They'll do meetings because that's natural. They'll do private chat because they understand private chat. But if you don't get the team process right, and there's 70 teams called something to do with sales, then I don't know where to go. I'm just going to email my boss or chat my boss. And getting it wrong in terms of too much lockdown can also give a bad user experience. So if you're blocking or delaying team creation for hours, days, or God forbid, weeks, you're going to impact user experience. People aren't going to use Teams. If you're blocking features that people could benefit from, like guest access or third-party apps, then users aren't going to naturally gravitate towards Teams. And if you lock this all down, I mean, crazy things like having really, really short retention periods, like you can't hold data for more than days or weeks in a channel, you're just going to drive shallow IT. The user is going to go and find some other tool that lets them do what they want, and net you've got a theoretical, secure, compliant governance system, but nobody in the business is using it. So what's the point? Like, I think we've gone past the days of IT where you could say, well, the system is compliant, and if they choose not to use the system, that's not my fault. Like, our job in IT is to enable the business, to support the business. If they're having to go to third parties to solve their problems, when quite legally they could have used our tool if we set it up better, then that's got to shoulder some of the blame on us. And of course, IT management, but very deliberately last on my list. IT, like IT, surprise, surprise. So often we come at projects with like how can I make this super organized and super managed and easy for me and easy to control? Like, that stuff is important, but again, if you're not enabling the users, what's the point? Like, you're just creating this process that is perfect for IT but not perfect for the business. And lastly, on kind of the why and the what's the governance goal? It's really to enable safe collaboration for the business, not to block the business. You've got to have an understandable user experience. So we'll talk about things like controlling guest access, things like naming conventions. If that doesn't make any sense to the users, they're going to have a horrible experience. If you're expiring teams automatically very quickly and you've not communicated that, why you're doing it or how you're doing it, they're going to lose faith in the system. And we're trying to drive towards a sustainable model or framework without lots of manual process. So we're not trying to create a job for IT where I have to have a person come in and manually do a whole bunch of steps every day. As much as possible, we want this process to scale for the business. So wherever we can automate or control or guide users in a non-human hands on the keyboard way, the better it's going to scale. So we've talked about the importance of governance. We talked about who should be involved in the conversation. Let's jump into some decisions that need to be made. So again, I'm going to zero in on the team element of teams. So who can create teams is a very important conversation. Naming convention or naming policies, group classification, so classifying the container and the information that's in that container or that group. And again, I'm using team and group interchangeably. Where I'm talking about group, it's because we're relying on Active Directory or Azure Active Directory group policies to control some of these things. When I talk about creating a team, we're primarily talking about the user in Teams. And things like group expiration policy, very interesting. Deleting and archiving teams, how do users do it, how do IT do it? And then it's an imperfect system, but I kind of think about managing the team and then content of the team. And in content of the team, you can have apps in your team. So how do you manage that app process? Very, very important. Lots of people have apps on by default. And is that an IT blessing that you can use any app in Teams because it's available in Teams, when all those third parties have different control processes around data and data sovereignty and access, that kind of thing? And last but not least, guest access. We'll finish on that because that's a really hot topic. And I often say this when I'm talking to customers, like, no decision is a decision to accept the Microsoft defaults. So lots of people avoid this conversation, can't get all the people in the room at the same time. We've seen with COVID a massive increase in the use of Teams, which is great, but it sparked a lot of these conversations again. So don't pretend if you're not having these discussions, that you're not making a decision, you're just accepting the defaults. Okay, so let's dive into those decision topics. So first one is controlling creation. This is always the sort of top topic in these workshops. Like, everybody's worried about sprawl, and naturally a lot of people come to, well, if we control creation, we can avoid sprawl, because we'll be very diligent about who gets a team and why they get a team, and we'll make them jump through all these hoops, and we'll tightly control the process, and they'll fill in all these forms, and it'll be great. It's not, even if you did that, like, it doesn't stop people then abandoning the teams afterwards or not using them. So controlling creation is not a way to manage sprawl in its own right. It just potentially slows it down. And conversely, all the things you're saying about controlling sprawl there are just slowing the business down, just getting in their way. So don't think about it as controlling sprawl. The creation process for teams is the creation process for Office 365 groups. So when people talk about turning off group creation for users, they need to bear in mind that they're turning off group creation across all of Office 365. And I think Microsoft are very deliberately drawing this line and trying not to give organizations an ability to just turn off team creation and not turn off group creation. Like, the point is, Microsoft, all things being even, want to empower the users and want to give you the controls to empower the users successfully, not have IT just turn it off, make you fill in a ServiceNow form, wait your few days, get your team. That's not 2020 IT. If you want, group creation can be restricted to select users, so you could have certain users create teams, certain users not. Microsoft, for example, they have lots of AD accounts for vendors that are accounts on their system, and then they have full-time employees, and they only let full-time employees create groups or create teams, groups by definition. So that's a consideration. You might only allow a certain type of person to create teams. And you've got to consider, do you want public teams, do you want private teams, or the one case of an org-wide team as well? So lots to consider there. Also bear in mind, teams will let you create teams with duplicate names. There's no default control over that in any way. Teams are a kind of a GUID under the covers, but you can have 10 teams called accounting or 10 teams called sales. Team owners essentially have admin over the team or over the group. So again, even if you're controlling creation very carefully, your team owner can later change settings, change names, add or remove channels. So don't think of creation as a one-stop shop to lifecycle management. It's really not. And an outlier case, but I'm fortunate to work with some very, very big organizations, hundreds of thousands of users. You can have up to 500,000 teams or groups on a single tenant. So if you're at that scale of having that many users, then you need to bear that in mind for your lifecycle management. So you've obviously got the native experience, and then I'm sure everybody at this conference is well aware of that, so I didn't want to go over that. You can jump into Teams, create a team, but you can also put some kind of additional process over the top. So I've seen lots of good examples of people using Power Platform to create a form or an input that creates a team on the basis of the Graph APIs. There's a great example on YouTube from Novartis. If you Google Teams Governance Superheroes, Novartis have used Power Apps very extensively to create a provisioning process. So there are abilities in the native Microsoft 365 platform to create a provisioning process. You are sending the people out of the native experience somewhat to do that, so that's the consideration. And there are also third-party tools. So I work for Modality Systems. We have a third-party tool called Create Team. There are lots and lots of other vendors that have third-party tools to create teams, and they do have some benefits. You can collect a lot of specific information, so you control the creation form. You can say who's it for, how long is it for, all our detailed requirements for reporting. You can control the user experience very granularly, so you can say who can have access to certain types of templates, who can create this type of team, who can create that type of team. You could have a selective approval process. So this type of team or this type of person is auto-created, but this team, because it has private and it has guests in, or this type of team where they want these type of apps needs an approval process. And you can have default templated teams for different scenarios. So you can jump to Power Platform or to third party to get an additional level of control. And again, compliance people, that's usually the route they'll want to go down. It's important to consider the negatives of that. It is a native experience is really important. So is the third party app a native experience on desktop and mobile? So great, got a web browser, go to createateam.company.com. Like, how does a user really know that? Like you have to make it as native an experience as possible. If you're going to go down this route, I talked earlier about if you disable group creation, then you're going to disable it for all groups, not just teams. So consider if you want to do that. And remember, team owners are able to change settings afterwards. So if you use a third-party product to add a naming convention, that's great, but how's that maintained through the life cycle of the team? So my general advice is don't block naming, don't block the native experience unless you really need to. If you do need to for business requirements, look at meeting as many of those requirements as possible, and don't consider this a one-stop shop for lifecycle management. It's really not. Also, a little tip, last slide on creation. Look out for this coming soon. There is a native template experience coming to Teams. So you'll be able to create templates in the Teams admin center. You'll be able to have them show up for your users. They'll be able to select them. As a blog where I've gone over some of the features there. But the creation process natively is getting better and better all the time. So that's the first step, creating. Closely followed to creating is naming policy or naming conventions. IT loves a naming convention. So there is an ability in Office 365 to have AD group naming policy that adds a prefix or a suffix to the team name or the group name, and that will literally show up in the client. I'm really not a fan of this, particularly prefixes. They really ruin the user experience. So it's like, this is an ability that IT want to manage the teams. They want to be able to search for teams with FR for France at the start of the name, or for HR for every HR team. Well, that's great for IT, but for the users, if they're in HR and all the HR teams are prefixed with HR, all they end up in their Teams client is everything is HR dash, and it's really jarring as a user experience. Particularly when you're on mobile, you can't see full team names. If you're going to use naming, suffixes are better because at least they're a little bit out of the view of the user. But if you can, try and find another way to manage how you understand Teams without just brute forcing various codes into the name. It doesn't really do good things for user experience. A bit more useful is you can also have custom blocked words. So you can block a whole list of words if you want to. You might want to block things like CEO or HR or finance or anything applicable to your organization that you want to maintain as tightly controlled. So that I'm a little bit more of a fan of. But naming policy, unless you have a real requirement, it's not the best thing for user experience. So then group classification. So we've created our team, we've either had a naming policy or we haven't. What we really want to know in governance is what is that team or group for, and what types of data are in it, and how does that influence how that team or group should act and be configured. So what Microsoft are driving towards, and it is an evolution, it's constantly changing, is sensitivity labels, and generally labels in Office 365 are used to, as the name suggests, label either containers or individual files. And now you can pick a sensitivity label for a team during the creation process. So you create your sensitivity labels in the Security and Compliance Center. They will appear to you in the creation process, and those can define policies on the team. So things like, if I choose a sensitivity confidential, I can only have a private team. It makes no sense to allow users to have sensitive information in a public team that can be accessed through the whole of the org. So it's worth digging in sensitivity labels, and this session is not about how you configure them step by step, but these can be used to define things like minimum levels of ownership, if the team can have guest access, what type of team can be created, whether it's public or private, They're still evolving, but they're definitely worth seriously looking at for your management of your governance of Microsoft Teams. I always think it's a miss if these aren't looked at. In terms of the user experience, they add a little label at the top right of the team, so users can know what type of team it is. It's not the most overt UI experience, but really the upside is the back-end reporting and configuration, or applying policies based on those sensitivity labels. For more on those, there's a really good Microsoft Docs page there to check those out. So hopefully we've now labeled our team, we've got some idea of what it's in. How do we deal with that tidy up in terms of lifecycle management, whether it's manually deleting, archiving, or automated? Again, Microsoft have an answer here. It's AD group expiration policies, and they can be used to auto delete a team that hasn't had any activity and ask the owners to confirm if they want that team deleted or renewed. So you can set this policy in Microsoft 365, Office 365 level. Microsoft do this in their own internal deployment. They use 180 days as their default. And what happens is the policy will apply to the team or group. If there's activity in the team, files are being used, chats being used, it can auto renew. If there's no activity, about 30 days, it will prompt the user to say, the owners more specifically, to say, hey, your team needs to be renewed. Initially, this was just email. It wasn't great because if you live in Teams, you might miss the email. But now it appears in Teams as a little icon. You can renew your team directly from Teams. If you miss the renewal for whatever reason, it goes into soft delete. So you've still got another 30 days to restore it. It can feel a bit scary for IT to automatically delete businesses' data. But if you don't choose to go down this route, you need to make sure you've got another plan for dealing with archiving and deleting teams, because it will get big quickly. So what's the other plan, deleting and archiving? If you don't go down the group expiration, at some point your users or IT, and I would suggest really you want the owners to do this, need to delete the teams. If you delete them, you've got 30 days to recover them, and then they're gone. So bear in mind that is the deadline you've got if users delete them or if IT delete them. There is an interesting alternative in Microsoft Teams, which is you can archive them. So archiving just makes them read-only. It makes the channels read-only, it makes the SharePoint read-only, but they're still discoverable in Microsoft Teams. So it's kind of a flag for like, stop using this team, stop collaborating here, but this is for reference. Bear in mind that some parts of Teams, like the third-party apps or the first-party apps in some cases, won't drop into read-only. So because you've got a OneNote in that group, it doesn't really understand the Teams read-only. People might still use the OneNote or the Planner. So it's not a perfect read-only archive, to be transparent. And also archiving doesn't stop AD expiration policies. So they're independent. So if a team is archived, it will still flag as unused and will get deleted if the owners don't renew it. An alternative to that we see some customers use is when users are ready to be done with a team or when the life cycle is ended, we can kick out all the users from that group, add a service account, kind of keep it hidden, but still alive, and restore it very easily by just adding select people or all people back in. So we've talked about the groups now. We're going into things in the team. Last two, apps and then guest access. So apps, very, very important, often overlooked. Microsoft allow access to all kinds of apps in Teams by default. They may not all meet your governance, compliance, security requirements. Just because it's available in Teams doesn't mean your org is happy about how that third party handles, holds, processes, stores data. So bear in mind at the global level, you can disable third-party apps or enable them. You can stop new third-party apps being automatically shown, which is quite a useful tick box. If you go to take the time to control which apps users can have, you don't want new apps just appearing for them, then IT having to chase and disable them. So that's quite a useful tick box. And you can control how people can interact with those third-party apps as well. That's kind of global level. You can get more granular than that with app permission policies. So I might want certain users or certain teams to have access to certain apps. That doesn't mean that everybody gets access to them. So a nice thing about control here is I can have a very restrictive policy generally, and I can have a more free policy for certain people, certain countries, certain groups. So be sure to check that out. Don't leave apps completely unrestricted if you're in any kind of compliance or regulatory industry, because users will infer that because they're available, they're blessed, and then they can start putting data in them that might not be appropriate. And last but not least, guest access control. So unfortunately, I see lots of orgs want to turn this off completely because they don't like people coming into their org, but it just drives people to use email and Dropbox and any other third party to share files and collaborate. So I don't think the answer generally is turning this off. What guest access enables is for you to audit and control guests coming into a space, so that having access to select files. You can very tightly control who can come in by domain, who can invite guests, and you can track everything that happens through the audit log. So I'm very down on turning guest access off by default, but it does need, again, management. So some good things to consider are you could have users in your org that have specific permissions to invite guests, guest inviter role. That might be a consideration. You might want to have a seniority level or some kind of other level where someone is accountable and responsible for a guest coming into a team. You can block or allow specific domains. So maybe you have a process where before any guests get added, they have to be on an approved domain list. So their org is vetted for basically we're even interested in having them in our tenant. And you can get right down to the either Microsoft Teams team or the Office 365 group level. So for example, you might use sensitivity labels to disable guests by default on certain teams except a certain type of team. Or you might just have the policy disabled. Unfortunately, the way the policy works is it's enabled by default at the team level and you have to disable it. You can't disable it by default and then have it enabled on a team by team basis without the use of kind of clever policies and sensitivity labels. So do bear in mind that if you've left the defaults, you've probably left guest access on. You need to have a look at that. So yeah, recommendations, don't disable it out of hand. It's not really for your one-time file share. Like if I'm sending a file to someone, an external party to print for a marketing campaign, probably email's better. OneDrive link, share, expire the link, that's great. This is for organizations that you're going to be collaborating with on an ongoing basis, shared projects, group experiences, contractors that are working with you for a long period of time, that kind of thing. And tenant switching can be tricky for the guest. So as well as enabling guests, train your internal users to help guests understand how they get in, what they get access to, that kind of thing. It can be really successful if you're working closely with other organizations. It's highly auditable and controlled compared to other methods, but it does need some thought. Last but not least, reporting. Not a great deal here kind of in terms of slideware, but there is some good stuff in the Teams Admin Center to see what teams are and how they're created. It's very quickly becomes non-scalable. If you've got thousands of teams, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, as one of my customers has, Teams Admin Center is out really for control. There's PowerShell. There's lots of great scripts online, so it's really worth Googling around for things like teams without owners, teams without expired content. Microsoft Graph gives us an ability to get into Teams and see a lot more detail, like the number of channel messages, who's posted, when they posted. You are getting more techie to do that, but it definitely can be done. And there are a number of third-party products. I would look carefully at what's in the box before going down the third-party route, and I say that as a vendor who does third-party stuff, that there's lots of good stuff in the box. When you get to a certain scale or you want a certain level of automation or processing, third parties can add a real value in this space. And there are a number of third parties in the VR hall that you should definitely talk to about this process. So that's me. Hope you've enjoyed the first session. Governance can be a bit intense, but coming from a UC person into governance, hopefully that's made it a little bit more accessible. I see we've got a few questions in. Maybe Dave's going to highlight some, and then we're going to go through jumping into the Hangout session afterwards. So this go to teams.fans break 103. I'll be hanging around in there. That's a regular Teams meeting, so it'd be great to say hello if any of you want to hang around for that. Check out the blog. I spend way too much time talking about doing this team stuff. So tomtalks.blog is where all that thoughts and news goes, and some links down at the bottom there, and thanks. There's a good Ignite session on governance. The Office 365 IT Pros book is very good, and the Microsoft documentation is traditionally not great, but these days the docs are really strong, so definitely a good place to start.
Great, thank you, Tom. Take a little sip there. We do have a couple of questions. We've probably only got really 5 minutes, but as Tom says, there's a breakout session directly after this. I'll post a link for that shortly as well. So it's obviously on Tom's slides, but I'll post a link. So just in terms of pulling out a couple of interesting questions to maybe talk through right now. One is, I suppose, about philosophy. So Maxwell Gregory's asked, at our company, we do not allow our end users to create their own teams. They submit a request, we ask a few clarifying questions, and then we set up the Office 365 group and the teams for the end user. And we would then make them team owners. Is this approach against the ideals that Microsoft had for teams and empowering end users?
Yeah, I think it is. Obviously, it's a personal organizational choice, and we absolutely have customers that do exactly the same thing. So I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. But if you look at like my workflow, for example, I would be super frustrated in my role if I want to create a place to work, a workspace, a team at Thursday night at 8 o'clock because I'm working flexibly because that's what I do, and I have to wait for IT to approve it. Like, what are IT going to do? I'm pulling my boss and a couple of my peers into a group to collaborate. I don't need IT approval for that. So I can see why IT want to do it, and there's a lot of upside to it from an IT point of view, but from a user point of view, you are getting in my way. And I think that's what Microsoft are driving at, is all the competitive third-party shadow IT tools just let you go and do that. Like, they don't get in the way. You're in danger of driving your users to use third party, or I see a lot of using private chat. Like, people end up using private chat like a team because they have to wait for a team. So probably you've got good intent, you might have good business reasons, but all things being even, I would allow users to create teams, maybe with the exception of allowing things like guest access where they have to go for approval, that kind of thing.
Perfect, thank you. In terms of guest access, there's an interesting question as well from an anonymous poster here about sensitivity labels. So there's quite a couple of questions here about sensitivity labels, but one of them, can you use sensitivity labels to block external guest users in Teams environments?
Yes, you can. Yeah, so you can set sensitivity labels, label the container, and then policies attached to the labels. And honestly, Microsoft have been a bit of an evolution around how labels work and how policies work. But you can, and I'm struggling to think where it is on the timeline of TAP versus GA, but you can set a sensitivity label that says no external access on the group or no guests allowed in the group, and that will filter through to the team. So yeah, it's a good thing to look at.
Super, thank you. Another question. So in the past, Teams didn't respect or support the guest inviter role. Does it now work?
Yeah, good question. I haven't used it in production, so I'd have to double check. My understanding is that it did respect that, but let me go and double check that. It's a great question. Or if anybody who's on knows, we'll talk about it in the Hangout afterwards.
But a couple of extra new questions that have just come in. Nicola Delan has asked, are there any good resources that give a summary of what guests have access to, plus the difference between a guest access and an external access? Thanks.
Yeah, the docs are actually pretty good. Like, the naming convention is horrible here. I mean, Microsoft and naming is always fun. But broadly speaking, like a guest is in the team and has access to data in that team, although, and you're probably hinting at this in your question, there are certain things they don't automatically get access to, like, for example, stream recordings of meetings in the team. Stream doesn't understand that, so they can't get access to them, that kind of thing. Whereas external access, or we used to call it federation in the Skype world, is just peer-to-peer chat between two users of different orgs. So docs are actually pretty strong on this. Go and have a look at those. And the Teams forum, tom.qa/Teams forum is the short code for the tech community forum. There's lots of people ready to answer questions there on that as well.
And the final one is a really interesting one from Matthias. He's actually answered his own question, which is good. So does the upcoming template function only allow default templates, or will we be able to create templates of our own? So he said, yes, you can create templates of your own, and posted a link to the Teams blog talking about templates. I think templates is going to be massive for this whole area of governance.
It definitely is. Like, it's a real upside to the governance story about giving people new usability. So yeah, templates will be really strong, I think.
Perfect. definitely all we have time for this session. So if you want to talk with Tom following the session, you can find him in the session breakout. I've posted a link. So the link is in the Q&A. It's goteams.fans/BRK103. So head over there, and I'm sure Tom will hang around for a little bit longer to answer any of your questions. So thank you very much, Tom, and hope everybody enjoys the breakout session.
Yeah, thanks for attending, everybody. Thanks, Dave, for producing, and I'll see you on the Teams in the breakout. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks.